Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good overnight, wherever you are in the world. I'm not going to list all the locations this week because you know where you are. I'm in New York, and my wonderful, inspiring, delightful, adorable guest joins me from Ireland today, Tara Erraught, mezzo-soprano, who has soprano tendencies, I've noticed. Um, Probably the most famous Irish opera singer of the moment, but there are many, and we're going to talk a bit about singing in Ireland and the musical training tradition in Ireland. But Tara, welcome.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you.
Great to see you, Fred.
And this being Friday, the 9th of October, I know that in a couple of days, you are scheduled to sing at the Wexford Festival, but in our pandemic times, it's a bit wait and see, even though you've been rehearsing. It's Rossini's Petite Messe Solennelle, and the conductor is Kenneth Montgomery. How are rehearsals going?
Well, I mean, it's an amazing piece. It's such an incredible piece. And to do it now is really poignant. Um, what for me is so interesting. So, this is also a huge year for the Wexford Festival because they have a new intendantin in Rosetta, and she has done an incredible mammoth job to do an entire festival online, which has never ever been done before. So, absolute kudos to her. The way they've also organized all the rehearsal process and the performance layout has been really comforting because we know we're really well taken care of and we're not ever put in any danger. We're never very close. So it's also been a very strange, it's wonderful, but very strange rehearsal experience when you're so far away from everybody. And we're used to kind of, especially, if it's a new, for example, for me, when it's a new soprano colleague and you come to do the duet, and there are a few turns and a few little cadenzas, and when you're trying to rehearse them, usually you're nearly on top of each other. You're nearly ear to ear until you really hear the vibrato and you really hear what they want to do and where they're going. And now to rehearse that really at a distance, it changes the chamber music aspect. It's not bad, I have to say. It's actually really interesting, and it's something that we've all had to adapt to now, is learning how to work slightly further apart from each other. But it's been really creatively interesting also because it's turning out new colors that we wouldn't necessarily find when we blend so quickly by standing so close together. So I have to say it's really interesting, and not in a bad way. Really interesting.
You remind me of something. It's a story I've told on a couple of occasions, so listeners, if you've heard it, bear with me. Um, in the late 1970s, when I was a tiny child, I was a young man, I worked at La Scala. I was the assistant to Giorgio Strehler, who was their magnificent stage director. And of his many great productions, my favorite was Simone Boccanegra by Verdi. And he had staged it in the late 70s with a fantastic cast, including Mirella Freni, Piero Capuccilli, Ruggero Raimondi, Jose Carreras, people of that stature, and Nikolai Gyaurov later on. And when it was to be restaged, it was my job in part to do the restaging, to learn how to take a director's notes. He was there to teach me, but it was really my job to do it. And the conductor both times was to me, peerless Claudio Abbado, who was a fantastic teacher. And they decided that for my purposes of education, they would have Mirella Freni sing her aria Come in quest'ora bruna from the first act of Boccanegra, all the way upstage, which is how Streller wanted it to be, while Maestro Abbado conducted in the pit. And the lesson was that when you're singing at such a distance from the orchestra and can't see the maestro's baton, there is a fraction of a second of delay between the coordination of the orchestra and the soloist. As Franey, with me next to her so I could hear, walked forward onto the stage and then down the stage, that fraction of a second became a smaller fraction of a second as she came closer to the orchestra. she being a magnificent musician, Abato being the perfect conductor. They made it happen. But I realized at that moment, as if I'd never known it before, that if you place someone at a different position on the stage, upstage, downstage, there's a tiny fraction musically that often can be off. And it must be the same thing that you described. I never thought of it this way. Normally singers are very close together, but when they're distanced, they have to listen in a different way. This leads me straight to the number one question I want to ask you. You had, as your main teacher, and I think you study with her still, the very famous, very beloved Veronica Dunn, known to many people as Ronnie Dunn, who was born in 1927. She's Irish. She's one of the last people around who sang with Maria Callas in the early 1950s. I had the fantastic pleasure of co-teaching a master class with her at the Royal Irish Academy of Music. I'm going to ask you to describe her inimitable style, her technique, and I will simply say that Veronica Dunn, what they very smartly did at the Royal Irish Academy of Music was, not only does she teach singers, she teaches singing teachers, so that all over Ireland, people teach the Veronica Dunn method. So one day when she's no longer teaching, there will be dozens and perhaps a couple of hundred of people who know the Veronica Dunn method and can pass it on. Talk about studying with her and what she taught you and what that method might be.
Well, I can give you the perfect Ronnie story. And that was when I was in my final year of high school. I had always heard of Ronnie and had never dreamed that she would even consider to teach me, because she was really for, you know, the top of the top and the cream of the crop, not beginner undergrads. And at this stage, I was singing competitively since maybe the age of 10. So I had seen her a few times at the Feis, and the Feis is an Irish set of competitions. And when you get to the senior end of the Feis, there's all sorts of competitions, including a scene from an opera where you have to stage it yourself and to come and perform it. I was at this stage a very eager 17-year-old who decided that she was going to pick between Norma or Desdemona. I thought, oh, the Salce, that's in me. I'm going to do that. So off we went to Dublin. We had borrowed a kneeler from the local church, and I had this incredible white nightgown that we borrowed from somebody. And I came out onto the stage in Dublin. And I felt like I was just the embodiment of Desdemona. I give it all I had. And, you know, with I can't even call it Italian. It was probably too much of an insult to the language, what I did. But Ronnie walked up to me, and I remember seeing her coming. And she said, and now, Ronnie, if you're watching this, excuse me for my imitation. She said, "Lovely. It's an interesting voice, but your Italian was shite." I was just so quickly taken aback that I'll see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow in the academy. I had never been to the academy. I didn't know where it was. I'm thinking, my God, what? And at this stage, I was still at school. So this was a Friday morning. So my parents had to, you know, get me the permission not to go to school, bring me back to Dublin. And I went in to sing for her. And we sang through everything I knew. And she said she didn't want to hear any more opera, but she'd hear the things I liked to sing. And at that time, those were the traditional Irish folk songs of Thomas Moore, and really any folk song, because of course I understood them and I understood the language. And straight away she said to me, okay, you're an actress that can sing, and we have to make you a singer that can act. And she picked up her phone and she called John O'Connor, who at the time was the director of the National Concert Hall. He's an incredible pianist, and he came into her studio, and she had him sit at the keyboard and play some things through. And then she made me wait outside the room. And about 20 minutes later, she called me and she said, okay, it's like this. You didn't apply through any of the right avenues to come here and study third level, which I hadn't. I had applied to other universities and already been accepted. She said, so we're going to do X, Y, and Z and put you on this interim course. And the next year you skip into second year. And within the space of this hour, you know, my whole future plans had changed. And that was it. We didn't question it, because once Ronnie says you're going to do something, you're going to do it. And when I then, that following September, had graduated high school and I went to study with her, I went with a mega amount of repertoire, because I had been singing at that stage for quite a long time. And she said to me, for the next 6 months, you will sing nothing but scales. And I kind of laughed. I didn't take her seriously. I thought, she won't do that to me. But my God, she was serious. And eventually, after the 4th month, I begged. I was like, please, please give me a line of anything, just one phrase of anything. And she sent me out to buy the Schirmer 24 Italian art songs. And no exaggeration, for the next 6 months after that, so 10 months altogether, I sang that book cover to cover in every key until I knew them all backwards. And she is such a believer, and rightly so, in the old school Italian vocal technique, where you must figure out pure vowels and you must figure out vocal placement as early as possible, because adding any layer on top of that is almost wasted if the foundation isn't strong enough. For example, when I came to Dublin, Ronnie found my accent was quite country compared to hers. And she said to me that she wanted me to go and buy half a dozen apples at a famous market street in Dublin called Moore Street. And Moore Street is city centre. It is this beautiful, raw, really, really round vocal accent. So like really broad ahs and things. And I would go there once a week for a couple of weeks to buy her these apples until I eventually had this ah sound on my ear. And because I couldn't go to Rome or Florence or whatever during the academic year, she would send me there once a week to hear this. And she said it was as close to the Italian sound as we would find in Dublin. And she had really incredible ways of working. So for example, I really work well with pictures and with visuals, and she could give me these incredible images to keep in my mind. And then Fred, maybe you would come for the lesson after me and you would want to know the science behind the muscles, and she could also explain that to you. She has an ability to speak a language to every person that comes in. And I think, I mean, I wasn't lucky enough to ever get to see her perform, but that must have been also the same in her performance. She must have had that same public reach, that regardless of who the people were, she could get something across to everybody. And her teaching room was like a bus station. You know, it was always full of people. Your lesson was never just one-on-one. There was always 3 or 4 other people in the room. And very quickly, she could point out the people that were going to make it and the people that maybe should consider doing something else. She was brutally honest, which I've
Yes.
always been very grateful for. I'm still very grateful for it. You know, when I went to Munich first, I hadn't finished my undergraduate degree and I was given a place in the opera studio at the Bavarian State Opera. So Ronnie would travel over and back every second week to make sure that, first of all, I was still having my lessons, that the voice was fit for what I was being asked to do there, and that I was still covering the things I needed to do to finish my exams in Dublin. And I was so lucky that she also committed to that, because it meant then she was there also for my first Sitzprobe, or for my first stage in orchestra. You know, when you've only been at university and performing in a room that fits maybe 200 people, and then you go to a stage where there's 2,500 people, the fact that she was there and was able to say to me, rely on the technique, there's no need to push, you have it all within you, was an absolute blessing. And as you know yourself, I mean, she still travels with me. She's, am I allowed to? Well, I'm going to say it anyway, Ronnie, you can kill me later. She's 93 now, still fit as a fiddle, still travels, would have come to New York in March, had things not all stopped. And I'm very grateful for that, because it's massively, massively important.
I just want to mention to listeners that Tara was in New York in March when the pandemic hit, and she was to star as La Cenerentola, as Angelina by Rossini, and did her final dress rehearsal, and then unfortunately everything came to a halt. You and I were supposed to do a conversation like this
Yeah.
in front of an audience in New York when you sent me an email saying, I'm at the airport, I'm on my way, I'm very sorry, but I have to go back to Ireland before everything shuts down. So I'm glad that I have you here.
Me too.
I want to talk to you later in detail about the Bavarian State Opera, which is one of the world's great companies, the Bayerische Staatsoper. And, but I guess one thing you said, what do the Bavarians make of someone like Veronica Dunn, who is such an entirely other kind of figure from the Bavarians, even if the Bavarians are very lustig and, easygoing compared to the stereotype and fun-loving, but Veronica Dunn is a force of nature in any country, and in Ireland, there are a lot of people like her, and that's part of why I love Ireland, but there are not a lot of people like her in Germany, and certainly not in Bavaria. What is that like when Ronnie is there with you in Bavaria?
I mean, it was quite incredible. First of all, she was welcomed with open arms in the theatre, because obviously, between insurance and different things, you always have to get permission if you want to bring in an outside tutor into the building. And the best thing was, because I was in the studio with 7 other singers, I mean, she would give time to anybody and never charged €1 or anything, and she would help anybody that was looking for the help. To be honest, I think it was my 3 wonderful American colleagues that got more of a shock from her than the Germans, because Ronnie doesn't have time to beat about the bush. If there's something to be said, she's going to tell you. And in one sense, the way the program worked also in Munich was that they also didn't beat around the bush. If there was something wrong, they were going to tell you. So they accepted her very quickly. And for example, within the first 6 weeks, they had absolutely no issue with, before they even presented it to me, with presenting her with a repertoire list to make sure that she agreed that those were the correct things I should be doing and singing. And if she had any other ideas, they were happy to add them in. And I think what I seen, the difference I seen then in Ronnie was that I could see, oh my God, her career really was expansive. I mean, everybody knew her. And she'd never give you that impression. The thing was, when I was still in Dublin, Ronnie has an international singing competition. And the first 2 years I was with her, she banned me from the feis. So I wasn't allowed to do any competitions. And I cut a deal with her, like as you do with the devil. I cut a deal and I said, well, tell you what, I'll do no competitions if you let me enter your competition in 2007. And we kind of laughed about it and she said, oh, okay, fine, whatever. We shook on it that day and I never forgot. In the run up to that competition, something changed. I'll never forget the lesson. I was singing the Romeo and Juliet of Gounod, the Stefano. And something changed in her look. I didn't know what it was. And she says to me, Lovey, you have to come and live with me. I thought, you what? And within 24 hours, I packed up all my stuff. I was living with her. We worked 7 days a week. We would do technique in the morning and repertoire in the afternoon. The competition was a whirlwind, and I ended up getting right through to the final, coming second. And all of a sudden there were contracts like from the concert orchestra and the National Symphony Orchestra, things I was not at all prepared for. I was only a second year. So again, I was lucky that Ronnie had this ability to also do business. She's not just a teacher, she does business, and she answered all the phone calls or the emails and said what I was able to do or not able to do. We'd work about the repertoire. She'd decide on the spacing between engagements and how long it might take to prepare or learn something. And that was also really evident then when I went to Munich, because she belonged there. She belonged in the middle of the nitty gritty. And one of my favorite memories is in my first year in the opera studio there, Kirill Petrenko was in Munich before he ever was the GMD, and he was conducting a new production of Jennifer with Eva Maria Vesbrook and incredible people. And he offered to do a masterclass with the opera studio. And it happened to be a week where Ronnie was there. And Ronnie came in, and Kirill, I was also in the Jennifer at the time. Kirill is such a kind and positive man, but he was quite quiet on this particular day. And Ronnie came in only for my session. And I can't even remember what he asked. It was something about a tempo anyway in Rosina. And Ronnie was like, I mean, she absolutely tore strips off me. I mean, she took us to shreds. He was only wanting to correct one coloratura, and she was like, oh, there's not a right vowel in it. And oh, it's not, And to this day, he and I joke about that. Like, no matter what I'll sing, and he'll say, "Oh, they're not the right vowels," you know. But she's not afraid of anybody, in a sense of her entire goal is to find the best vocal production. It doesn't matter who's in the room or who you are or I am. It really doesn't matter. And the most incredible thing are her ears, because she can hear things nobody else can, in my experience. And a force of nature for sure, but just incredible. And when you look at the legacy of people that she has taught, or the amount of people she's churning out year in, year out, it's incredible, really incredible.
She, for listeners, was born in Dublin, and I don't know too much about her early studies, but she found her way to Rome around 1950. And to imagine, so she would have been 23, to imagine Rome in 1950 with this incredible creative ferment, the nation rebuilding after World War II, Rome, a very beautiful city, but at that time poor, and therefore not many cars around, so people walked the streets, and there was a lot of animated life. The Roman Italian is not the best Italian, but I'm sure she corrected the Romans in how they speak Italian. And kind of like the market she sent you to on Moore Street. And
Indeed.
she lived in a convent. I don't recall if it's an Irish convent or an Italian convent, probably an Irish one.
It is Irish, yeah.
And she, so therefore, was surrounded by nuns who wanted her to be home by a certain time and did not want her walking the streets, a nice young Irish girl. But her talent was revealed, and she found her way into productions at the Rome Opera and sang, I don't remember the opera, maybe you know, in a production that starred Maria Callas. And in the early 1950s, probably 51 or 52. And then at a certain point after her stay in Rome, she came back to Ireland. She did sing for quite a while, but then by the early 1960s, she became a teacher.
Yes.
And
I mean,
what I always wonder about, maybe you can tell us, I watched her teach technique to many singers. And young singers primarily. In one case, a very young singer. He was probably 20. And he had beautiful raw material, a gorgeous bass voice and so on, but didn't understand any of the concepts because he arrived with a raw talent. And she tried in the most discreet but graphic way in front of an audience to explain his anatomy to him. And he was a nice young Irish lad, and he was very shy about hearing what was going on in around his navel and behind. And but she was so graphic, not in a pornographic way, but it was clinical for her. Yeah. And it was explaining how support happens. And I have seen her teach young men that way, and I've seen her teach young women that way. And because the anatomy is different, the explanation is different. And when I saw her, I guess in her late 80s for the first time, you see, or even mid 80s, you see her speaking so graphically, but clinically. There was no humor there. Sure. It was just, let's get right to the point and teach this boy what he needs to know in the time that we have. And I can imagine that certain people, especially young men, would find it rather awkward. Young women, it's like going to your gynecologist, that you're talking to someone about parts of you that women share with one another. Ronnie understood the men clinically, but frankly, we're talking Ireland, or in one case, Korea, and one case, Romania, where they're not necessarily with the men as open about talking about anatomy. I frankly think that in many schools in the world, that would be considered politically incorrect and too personal. I, for one, don't have an objection. I understand how this information has to be communicated. And she was, as I said, not gross or pornographic. She
Yes.
was anatomical the way a scientist would be.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine you sat in on classes where she would try to communicate technique. How do you teach technique? One day, Tara, if I'm certain about this, you will be teaching the Veronica Dunn technique. And what are you going to explain? I don't just mean anatomy, but given that technique is something as much here as it is there, how do you teach that?
I mean, the one thing that I learned from Ronnie and watching Ronnie teach is that she didn't buttercoat anything, or she didn't try and, you know, find a scientific or polite way of saying anything. She went straight to the root of the cause as quickly as possible. And for me, I think the most important thing is honesty, and honesty also then in production. And, you know, you can say to somebody, listen, here's a poster of the actual anatomy and every single muscle, and let's talk about that, and then I'll talk about the muscles. Or you can do it the Ronnie way and say, listen, this is exactly what's happening inside me. There are people, and I've seen her really explain graphically how certain things work, and then I've seen her give the exact same lesson to somebody and say, now think of a ping pong ball on top of a fountain, and you have to keep the ping pong ball afloat, and the same effect, the same result comes. But it's that she has this ability to know how that person's brain works. And that's something that I don't know if it's a gift from God, but she can read with people what exactly they need to fix whatever's going on inside them. But the one thing that she doesn't do is waste any time. And so if she knows a quick way of explaining that to you, that's exactly what she's going to do. Culturally also, her student list is absolutely multicultural at this stage, and there are people that come from all over the world to see her. And I have one very good Romanian friend who, after my time in Munich, our time in Munich, she decided to come to Ireland for 4 months and live with Ronnie to retrain the technique in full, because she thought what she had was an Italian technique, but in fact what she had was an Italian polish, and there is such a big difference. And she lived with Ronnie for 4 months. First of all, her English vocabulary now is gas. It's so funny. It's the most Irish thing I've ever heard. It's amazing. But also it completely changed her career trajectory. And she was saying that people thought because she could make this beautiful sound, they didn't question how she made it. And nobody ever said to her, are you using X, Y, and Z? And so she just presumed she was using it in the right way. And so, I mean, I understand that sometimes people may be slightly taken aback at the start. But once you give in to the process, my God, if you commit yourself, you can have that technique learned very quickly. You know, and I think that one of the things that I notice culturally now, because I work in so many different places, one of the first things I do when I come into a rehearsal room is say, you can say anything to me, because I have already heard much worse. Do not worry, I won't be offended. If it's for the character or for the music, it's not a problem. And it takes people some time to get used to that, but I don't mind. You know, 3 or 4 different people can be shouting corrections at me. It can be a linguistic person and a conductor and the stage director. It's great. I love that, because I think that's all constant improvement. And I learned that in her room, because you might have had lessons one day and there could have been a wall of people waiting for their lesson. There'd be a pianist. She may also have an Italian or a French coach in the room, and they're all shouting at once. And that kind of wonderful honesty built me for the career, there's no question. So when anybody is starting with Ronnie, and sometimes people, you know, might reach out to another student and say, oh my God, is that normal? I mean, am I going to be spoken to like that in front of people all the time? The quicker you're told to accept that and learn to love that, the easier the career will be, because you can find yourself in really intense situations, you know, or you can go to another country. You know, my first time to work in the States or in England, where everybody's so polite and you know, you're nearly taken aside to say, listen, maybe on that third bar you could just sing that a little bit quieter, or you know, whatever. Like I also now feel like maybe I'm a little bit Ronnie when I go into a rehearsal room and say, okay, open book, you can shout at me, I'll shout at you, it'll all be good. You know.
Given that mores, values, customs are different from country to country, do you think that, and especially I want to say not just in terms of countries, but in terms of era, that the kind of things and the approach that Ronnie does when I was coming up in opera, which was the 70s, when I was younger than you are now, and getting my first training in the Lyric Opera of Chicago, then in Bologna, then in Milan, then working at the Met. And we could say things to one another without offense. And I'm not talking about race or gender equality, anything like that, but just anatomical, physical, the ability to touch, the physicality of things was very different than it is now. And I'm not saying better or worse, but it was just different. And I wonder whether Ronnie gets a pass because of her venerability and being 93, but whether exponents of the Veronica Dunn methods, who now teach in Ireland and elsewhere, and one day when you will be, I'm certain, a great singing teacher, whether that same kind of approach can be taken, or whether you might have to in some way adapt or compensate to the realities of now.
I mean, it's a very interesting thing because actually I spoke to Ronnie in January, and I was saying to her, you know, that I could see within the industry already things were changing slightly. And I knew that if I was going to be allowed to work in New York, I had to do a training day. And I was really glad, if I'm honest, that they were offering this training. So you knew what was culturally appropriate or not. Because, you know, let's say, for example, you're working in Ireland. I mean, everyone is really into their work, but there is no union here. So there's nobody really kind of who can stop things from running over, or nobody who would say in a room that language is maybe a tick inappropriate, or, you know. And yes, I, so to speak, grew up now in the German opera system. And that's the system I know the best. So I was really glad that they had this course, this class. And I remember saying to Ronnie, I said, you know, I think it's like everything from, like, I'm not even talking about inappropriate things here, but like bad language. I mean, that would be Ronnie snookered if she could
Yeah.
know. So she was
She'd be
already
sent
saying,
home to
oh no.
Ireland.
Yeah, no, she was already, that was her out if there was no bad language, purely because she's at a point now where she has maybe no filter for that. But she was saying that also when she was working, I mean, you didn't go around the corridors of Covent Garden, you
Yeah.
know, roaring expletives. So I think it was different also when she was working. I think that her style, her teaching style has evolved because there were probably many frustrating points where, and she would often tell stories of incredible instruments that she has seen and heard, where either the person wasn't invested enough or just didn't really get it. And I think it was that general frustration that has now grown into this no frills approach, where she just says exactly what it is without any fuss. I think our industry now, for example, I went to New York, we had this class where they explained everything, and then we went to the rehearsal room, and I was in a very multicultural rehearsal room where we had only one American singer in the cast. So it was so interesting to have like one Korean singer and a singer from Israel, myself, a Mexican, it was two Italians, all these really kind of very different cultures. So we all just openly said, okay, are you comfortable to be touched? Am I, yeah, okay, that was fine. We cleared all that up. No swearing. I was like, okay, I'll work on that one. You know, it was a really comfortable experience. Like there was no awkwardness in it. And then COVID happened. I am one of the very, very lucky singers that since COVID has gotten to do an opera production. For the first time ever, I walked into a German rehearsal room where not only are you not allowed to touch, I mean, mother of God, you're not even allowed to use somebody else's music or take a pen or a whole other list of things you'd never even think of. And it made me reflect a little bit then on the kind of evolution of the industry up until before COVID, where I thought, my God, we were complaining about nothing, because now what we're going to have to get used to is a whole new ball game. And it's incredible. It's amazing that the theaters have put in this new way of working, and that they're willing to police it and teach us and remind us, because it's muscle memory more than anything else. But even, you know, you get lost in the minute. Yet one of the big rules you can't break at the moment, you can't hold somebody's hand at a curtain call. Well, that's the most natural thing in the world to do. So you do need somebody screaming from the side of the stage, don't touch each other. You know, it's an interesting point to find ourselves at. And certainly if things were to hopefully one day revolve to how they were before COVID, I would never again question people's comfort. The other thing I've noticed is how much happier some people are at never having to shake hands or hug somebody. And that's absolutely fine, but it would have gone way beyond my radar. I would never have noticed. So it's very interesting. And we're very, I don't want to say lucky, it's probably a terrible thing, but we're very blessed that people are so open at the moment in saying what's allowed and what's not allowed. And it's really black and white. There's nothing been left to interpretation. So it's quite comfortable in that sense, because you know you can't offend anybody, regardless of culture or background then.
When I was performance manager of the Met in the 1980s, that was the period when AIDS was everywhere. And there was no cure, there's still not a cure, but there were no therapies to keep people alive and functioning. And catching HIV and developing into AIDS was a death sentence for people. And that, especially, unfortunately, if it was a gay male singer, people stayed away from him, and colleagues were afraid to breathe with him and so forth. And we had conductors who died of AIDS, and we had at the Met ushers, stagehands, administrative staff. I was often the person responsible for approving their medical care and coverage, so I was very aware of who had what, and I always kept it to myself. And I had the conflict often of being in a rehearsal and wanting to say to a particular artist, don't go so close. But I couldn't do or say, and I wouldn't do any of that because I respected people's privacy. But I began in 82. We didn't know in 1982 how it was transmitted. Was it just sexual contact? Was it physical touch? Blood? We didn't know. It was just beginning to be defined, just the way we are 10 months in at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So I remember very well that you didn't kiss colleagues, you didn't hug colleagues. You wanted to, but you were very, very careful about that. So if you live long enough, this comes around again. And the training of the past. I'm sure that Ronnie remembers, I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the disease, polio, because polio, there was not a vaccine until the late 1950s. And therefore, she would remember that kind of issue of contact. I mean, these phenomena have always been with us throughout human history. And we need to always study history, including recent history, to learn from our mistakes and to learn from our experience. So, but it runs directly afoul of everything that opera is, which is sex, passion, politics, being politically incorrect, being outrageous, being completely transporting in your emotions in a way that's conveyed to other people. You know, I cannot imagine certain opera characters like Don Elvira, which you've sung. Don Elvira gets read a catalog of Don Giovanni's conquests. She's the last one to try to come save him when everybody else has given up on him. She comes back and tries to save him. She is a passionate individual. And if you play her placid and indifferent, blasé, that would never work for Don Elvira.
No.
So I believe going forward, we're going to see different stage concepts and different interpretations of how, perhaps with gesture, perhaps maybe with lighting or costuming, but at a certain distance, people like Don Elvira will have to communicate all that we know about her. We can't just say, well, you know, Curie Takano sang her this way, or Renee
Sure.
Fleming, Barbara
Yeah.
Friedli, Carol Vaness, you name it, in the past 20, 30 years. And therefore, they don't compare to now, or now doesn't compare to them. Factors were different, completely different.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
So, so many things to ask you. I think the next thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that you, as a very young artist, had the rather special experience of being invited to be a member of the company of the Bavarian State Opera, one of the world's great companies, sometimes the greatest one of all. And how old were you when that happened?
So I was 22 when I joined the
22.
Young Artist Program.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was an incredible, incredible experience. And at the end of my first year in the Young Artist Program, they asked me if at the end of the second year I would like to join the ensemble and become a principal resident soloist, which, I mean, blew my mind. It wasn't something I ever thought would happen. And to be very honest, when I was studying in Ireland, I wasn't particularly aware of the German system, because the organic Irish way of studying would have been you went straight from Dublin to London, or to England, also to Glasgow or Wales. So it wasn't something that I had heard of from my peers or didn't really know anything about. So when I moved to Munich, I was so unbelievably lucky that on the first day, I sat down beside this gorgeous American blonde called Angela Brower. And Angela Brower, along with two other American colleagues, Todd Boyce and Chris McGarrah, the three of them were fresh from Glimmerglass. They were three incredibly accomplished singers that had this unbelievable other young artist program under their belt, all from these huge schools in the States. And I was coming, having not yet finished my undergrad degree from the Royal Irish Academy of Music, which is one of the smallest conservatoires ever. I mean, it's incredible, the time and the things I was given while I was there, but it's a very, very different system than most.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was a big culture shock also for me, I have to say, to go from Ireland to Munich. Munich's an incredible, incredible city, but both the language and culture are just different. We were welcomed with open arms, there's no question. But this is going to sound very terrible, I made absolutely no attempt to change. And I'd like to say now that the Bayerische Staatsoper is slightly more Irish than it was when I went.
We'll
A
call
lot
it
more
the
people.
Irish Staatsoper.
A lot of the staff, I'm always so proud when they come on their holidays now to Ireland. And, you know, there's many other Irish singers there now too. But I would be saying to anybody out there that's considering their first steps within the industry, that the German system, the German speaking system, is absolutely unbelievable. I did 10 years altogether at the Bayerische Staatsoper. In that time, I had 48 role debuts. I had more than 260 performances on the main stage, not including things we did also in the Cuvier Theatre. The coaching I received was mind-bogglingly brilliant. Also the exposure, the other people. I mean, within my first 3 weeks there, Susan Graham sang Charlotte. And 4 times I went to bang on the door of the dressing room and I chickened out every time. I just couldn't do it. And it took until 2 years ago, I was singing Hansel and Gretel at the Met, and she came to the rehearsal room. And I fangirled all over her. I couldn't even bring myself to explain how excited I was to meet her. And I mean, of course, she had no idea that I was there outside the room or anything, but these people that we seen not only in performance, but in rehearsals, and seen kind of what's expected of you, the niveau that's expected also when you turn up to the first rehearsal, things that aren't taught at college, because of course nobody has time to teach you these things. So you learn on the ground, which is, I mean, you can't pay for that experience.
You refer to the German system. Would you explain for listeners who are not familiar with it, what is the German system in
Of
terms of
course,
opera?
of course. So the very interesting thing in Germany is that most of the theaters are state funded. And as state funded theaters, they're expected to employ as many people as possible. And when you take a theater like the Bavarian State Opera, they have over 1,000 employees. Now, less than 200 of those are musicians. So as you can imagine, it means that with so many house employees, from costume people, carpenters, finance people, instead of a theater that can produce maybe 6 or 7 productions a year, in Munich last season, it was 42
Yeah.
different operas. And I'm not sure, to be honest, the amount of ballets last season, but it's also a substantial amount. The turnover of repertoire in a house like that is incredible, but it takes an absolute mass of people to be able to produce that. The other interesting thing with the German speaking system is that their outreach program really involves children from the day they go to school. So there's a huge emphasis in getting the children into the theatre as early as possible. And I have to say, one of my big kind of culture shocks when I went first and was in pieces like Jennifer or Rusalka that I felt were maybe dark stories for children. There would be many children in the audience because it's part of their culture also, not just in their families, but also through school. And so that system is really, you might have 3 different titles a week, which is a lot. And it means then that the public are all quite local, and they go to the theatre once, if not twice a week.
I have some experience with that theater. I believe, and I'm sure I'm correct, it's the first German opera house I ever went to a performance in.
Oh,
I remember the date. I was thinking about it the other day. It was October 3rd of 1976. And it was Oktoberfest in Munich, which is not why I went, by the way. And it was the day of the national election for chancellor between the sitting chancellor, Helmut Schmidt from Hamburg,
oh yeah.
and his right-wing opponent, who was Franz Josef Strauss, who was then, I forget, either the mayor of Munich or the governor of Bavaria, for whom the beautiful Munich airport is named. Munich
Airport.
Airport is phenomenal with its beer gardens and cafes, and
Yes.
I would like to go to Munich Airport just for a day trip. Munich has incredible culture. It's Mozart made the most money anywhere he made in Munich with his opera Idomeneo, which he wrote specifically. There was the court opera there before it became the Bavarian State Opera. We know that in Germany, like Italy, Germany didn't become a nation until the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Wagner had a role in that. A lot of people had a role in that, but Bavaria was a thing unto itself with castles, King Ludwig II, all those stories. Wagner premiered at the Bavarian State Opera, Das Rheingold and Die Walküre before Building Bayreuth, not far away. And so the level of musical culture in Munich and Bavaria, even though they seem like rustic types who eat this big plate called Bauernschmaus, which is just all kinds of sausages and
Yeah.
dumplings and kraut and the whole, it's delicious, but it's not lightweight. Richard Strauss was from Bavaria. And although he did a lot of his work in Dresden for his premieres, 9 of his 12 operas were premiered in Dresden, he was a Bavarian composer with Viennese tendencies. And so the level of culture is phenomenal. The belief in supporting culture is incredible. Munich and Bavaria are the wealthiest parts of Europe, so there is the money to do that. The performance I went to, I'll back up a bit. I was working at the opera in Bologna and went to La Scala for a performance and was seated next to a woman, Frau Maria Brunner, who lived in the Englischer Garden in Munich, which is a very posh address.
Nice.
And I was seated in the box with her dressed like a 19-year-old student. And she spoke to me very politely. She had a jaguar coat made of real jaguar. She called it mein Jaguar. And we spoke, and I guess she liked me because she said, "You should come to Munich and I will invite you to the opera."
Amazing.
So I wrote to her. There was no email or even fax machines then. And I wrote to her and we arranged that I would come to Munich. She said, "We don't like Oktoberfest, but we do have a good opera on that Sunday, and I think you'll like it. It's Die Frauenerscharten by Richard Strauss, which is quite a leap for a 19-year-old boy living in Italy doing Italian opera.
Oh,
But
it's a big piece.
the stars were Birgit Nilsson, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, who I knew as a kid, so that
Oh,
he was here a lot in New York, and my family knew him. So I actually
okay.
knew Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. I'd never heard Birgit Nilsson. Actually, I
Amazing.
did once before in New York, but I was not that close. And what I
Okay.
didn't know about Frau Maria Bronner was that she was Bavarian royalty. And she sat in the central box that has a
The
dining area
Queen's Lodge.
behind. And there was a gentleman who came that evening who was known as Der Prinz, the Prince. And he was a somewhat disabled, very elegant, very gracious man. And while we were watching this amazing performance, to me very distracting because the sound, I now love Die Frauenerscharten, but at the time it was alien to me. But it was phenomenal, not just for the performers, but the experience, because at the interval, at the intermission, there was this buffet set up in the anteroom of the box. And Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau came up for a little bite to meet Frau Maria Bronner and the Prince. And he gave them news of the elections going on, whether it was Schmidt or whether it was
Oh,
Strauss winning, so that the whole backdrop of this was that. What I learned was that Frau Maria was on the right, she was for Strauss, and their prince was in favor of Schmidt, he was more on the left. And they were focusing on the opera and on Nielsen being phenomenal. And I believe it was not Leonie Rieseneck that night. It was supposed to have been, but it changed.
okay.
But I remember Nielsen as the dyer's wife. And
Amazing.
I don't recall who the Kaiser and the Empress was. But after the performance, Birgit Nielsen came up and there was a buffet and there were delicious Bavarian cakes and lots of champagne. And she said, "So who is this good-looking boy, Maria? Where did you find him?" And she said, "La Scala. I found him at La Scala. Very nice boy. When do you go back to Italy?" Well, I was actually like Cinderella. I had the midnight train.
Oh, Lord.
And I had to run to the station to get back on the train to Bologna. But I
Amazing.
remember all that. I remember that Schmidt actually won, and people in Munich were a bit disappointed, some of them. Maria Bronner said to me, "The prince is a wonderful man, but his politics are terrible." And the prince said to me, um, that Maria is a wonderful, very caring friend, but her politics are terrible. And I just was not going to go there. But they were kind of amazed when Fischer-Dieskau came at the first intermission. And he looked at me and said, "Freddie, what are you doing in Munich?" And they
Amazing.
were amazed that I knew Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau because he had been
For
a
sure.
guest many times in my family home here in New York. And
Amazing.
I wrote about this a number of years ago after Fischer-Dieskau died. But I tell the story, I'm not bragging, I hope it's not interpreted that way, to
Mhm.
explain that the whole world of opera is much more than simply what we see on the stage. It's an environment, it's a spirit, it's a fraternity.
Yeah.
And the fact that this very prominent, super wealthy, titled German woman would see a 19-year-old kid from America in Italy and decide that he should have this experience and invite me and make that, I stayed in her home to make
Amazing.
that possible for me. And I was so taken with all of this that I went back to Munich and I stayed for quite a while and I lived on the Rosenheimer Platz,
Oh,
which is
lovely.
very different from the Englischer Garden.
Yes.
And at that time, the place where I lived, this was 1976, there were no showers where we lived. And there was a public shower, a public place where people went to bathe, because most homes in that part of Munich, now a very wealthy city, this
Yeah.
was a poor neighborhood, there were no facilities. And so you
Gosh.
would go, I was on the Rosenheimer plots, you would go to this public shower and bathe, and there was a spa and a sauna, and everything was very clean and pleasant. But most people then didn't have private facilities in their homes in that part of Munich.
Incredible.
And but I remember walking the streets, going to the incredible art museums.
Yeah.
The Naschmarkt is this phenomenal, I'm sorry, that's Vienna.
The Victualian
The
market.
Victualenmarkt is
Yeah.
this incredible food market. Um, Dahlmeier is a wonderful shop and food store, and coffee and tea especially. But in the Victualenmarkt, I found a bakery that I still, the second I reach Munich, I go there for their
Oh,
Krapfen,
sweet.
for their
Oh, yeah.
jelly donuts filled with beautiful Marillen or Aprikosen jam. One eats incredibly well in Munich. Munich, yes, is Oktoberfest and the beer culture, but it is so much more. Uh,
Absolutely.
the Sammlung, I forget what it's called, the drawings gallery, um, the National Museum. They have 3 orchestras. Art and culture are available to people. And I mentioned finally what I
Incredible.
wanted to talk about, that Frau Neuschatten. I had never experienced an audience like the one in Munich. I had Luca Pizzaroni on 2 weeks ago, and we spoke about the audience in Barcelona, which is a
Hmm.
phenomenal audience, maybe the best in my experience. But in Munich, at that time, in the lobby at the intervals, people did not stand around drinking. They would walk, I guess because the operas were
Yes.
so long, in sort of a circle. And they
Yeah.
would walk around and around and around. And then I discovered that lower down, when I was no longer in the fancy box eating crab meat with royalty, um, is this wonderful buffet. And I think my favorite
Yes.
dining area of any theater in the world is either Madrid, Stockholm, or Munich.
Wow.
And in Munich, they have these beautiful sandwiches and prepared foods,
Hmm.
sour cherry juice. They figured out the foods that are not heavy on the stomach, but if you need to sit for the first act of Parsifal or whatever,
Yes.
just the right amount of food to get you through without, let's be blunt, needing the toilet.
Hmm.
Um, and then you come out and you have another little bit of a nosh or something. And then after the opera, often they have what they call souper, Souper. It's sort of a post-performance meal. So the whole ritual goes on for many hours. And when you have a city that emotionally is so invested in this, it results in this quality. And I finally want to say about Munich that the Bavarian State Opera in July, there's no better place in the opera world to be than Munich in July. That may sound strange when we'd rather be in the Mediterranean or Stockholm or wherever, but if you love opera, the festival that's held every July in, I guess not
Yeah.
this one, but every July in Munich,
Hmm.
is amazing, because all the productions you mentioned, there were 42 this year, all the productions that were outstanding with great casts would be brought back for 2 or 3 times so that you could fly in from New York or Tokyo or wherever and every night see the greatest stars in the world
Yep.
in productions. Carita Matula, Renee Fleming, my, I'm not going to say personal favorite, but if I had to pick one that I adore who does not travel, so I have to go to see her, Anya Harteros,
Yes.
who
Yeah.
is an extraordinary artist who lives in Germany. She sings a lot in Munich, a bit in Vienna, a bit in Milan, a bit in Berlin, but she
Mhm.
doesn't sing in too many places.
No.
And if it's kind of like seeing the Sistine Chapel, it won't move. You have to go to it. So we have to go to where Anya Harteros is. Jonas Kaufmann is from there and
Hmm.
sings often in Munich. So the level is phenomenal.
Yeah, it is.
Edita
It is.
Gruberova is a big favorite there. She's
Hmm.
practically retired. but really every great singer in the world finds her or his way to Munich eventually. And, you know, we talk about New York, London, Vienna, but we forget Munich.
Mm. And it's
Berlin is
easily done. It's easily done because it's so important to the locals,
yeah,
the opera there, that it doesn't even need, like, it's not dependent on any tourist audience. It's an extra bonus and they're very welcoming to people, but it's such a part of their local culture that actually it's never dependent on a tourist audience. And I think that also then says a lot for their programming, that, you know, although every year, yes, they will have Bohèmes and Zauberflöte and Hansel and Gretel, things that are traditional also at certain times of the year for family events, but then they'll push the boat out and you have these huge pieces, you know, that are incredible undertakings for any theater, but there it's kind of part of the course. The audience expect it, and the audience there also expect to be pushed a little bit. They want to be, they don't want always to be comfortable or get what they expect. They sometimes want to be, you know, they want their imagination stretched. But the one amazing thing for me with the public in Munich is that, for example, I've done most of my big role debuts there of the things that I sing all the time now. So Rosina and Cenerentola and Accompanist and whatever. But they'll come to the stage door and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, you've new ornaments." You think, well, I mean, I barely notice. You know, my colleagues on stage wouldn't notice, or they'll come and they'll say, "Oh, I hear more top there," or I hear, and you think, Jesus, they're more tuned into the instrument than I am myself. But for me, the cream, the cherry on the top of the cream of the cake is that when I moved to Munich, I very quickly met Brigitte Fassbender. And as it turns out, in a legacy sense, I now, or up until last year, had the ensemble job that she had
ah,
when she was also very, I mean, she went to that theater also incredibly early. She was younger than I was, she was 21. And almost every role I did, she did. And so this kind of legacy thing of that you're able to look, you're part of this huge historic institution. And also now that I get to work with her so regularly, not just on the operatic things, also on the leader, it's this whole other kind of musical culture that I had to go to Germany to learn and to understand, not just linguistically, but also the kind of performance history of it. That I think we also in our generation now have to really work to make sure that we learn that so we can pass it on, to make sure that it is, you know, even at times without audience demand, to make sure that it stays alive. And I don't know where else in the world I would have gotten so many different experiences in one place. So Munich, yeah, it stands out in that sense.
among the musical selections you provided, yes, there was one with Veronica Dunn, but there were two with Brigitte Fassbinder, Der Rosenkavalier, she was Octavian, and the Mahler's Second Symphony, where she sang the famous Urlich, the song, so
Oh,
beautifully.
yeah.
When I talk to people older than I am about the mezzo-sopranos that they were deeply influenced by, there usually are three who are mentioned, and many more, but in the German world, the three would be Christa Ludwig, Brigitte Fassbinder, and Tatiana Troyanos.
Sure.
In the Italian world, there would be Fedora Barbieri, Giulietta Simeonato,
Sure.
uh, people like that,
Mm-hmm.
but and many more. But Fassbinder, I think, is a little forgotten by people who didn't experience her artistry. She was centered in Europe. We had her here in New York, and she sang elsewhere. She became, if I recall, the head of the opera house in Innsbruck,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is a stone's throw from Munich. It's down the road a bit. Uh, Better apricots in Innsbruck than in Munich, but otherwise it's all good. And Innsbruck being the western end of what was the Habsburg Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And while Salzburg was independent, and Salzburg was not Habsburg for most of the time, the Habsburgs built beautiful palaces and theaters in Innsbruck. And it was different from Munich up the road, which was Bavaria. And back when these countries were all very different. But
Hmm.
for a small town at the foothills of the Alps, Innsbruck has an incredible amount of culture. I imagine you've been there a few times.
Yes. I mean, it's an
Um,
incredible place.
when I lived in Italy and worked in theaters there, if I needed to get away from the craziness of opera for a bit, I would go to Innsbruck, but then out of Innsbruck to a little town called Igls, Igls,
Oh, yeah.
which from the railway station, I think you take tram J or L to the last stop. And Igls is high in the mountains, and it was very Malerian because there would be cows grazing and cowbells and barns and hiking trails and fresh air. And I would stay at a little hotel built in the 1860s with Biedermeier furniture, and I had a single bed, and my balcony would overlook this
Amazing.
alpine scenery. And this was a 30-minute bus ride from the center of Innsbruck. So I could go to Innsbruck for the music and then get back and go to my little hotel. And that to me is a little bit of heaven. And I think that I would love to go back to Innsbruck when Brigitte Fassbinder is working there. Have you ever worked with her, sung with her, worked through any roles, or what has she taught you?
So what we did when I went first, I went because I was about to do a new production in Munich of Hansel and Gretel. She had done the premiere as Hansel of the last production,
Uh,
and it was such a part of the historic kind of upbringing of a huge amount of German people. Was a trip every Christmas to see this Hansel and Gretel. So I knew already that the public were going to go mad. They were going to expect something ground shatteringly brilliant. And I was the only foreigner in the cast. So I thought, oh, sweet Lord. And I knew I could play him. That I was sure of. And so I went to her and we went through the role. And when you have somebody like that who not only understands the instrument and kind of your abilities and the things that maybe still stand in your way, but also that has the experience to say, okay, look, here you're going up against 6 French horns, give loads of consonants, don't be worrying about the vowel.
mm,
Here they stop playing, blah, blah, or at this point, ask the conductor for help, or, things that you really cannot figure out yourself until you're on about show 12.
yeah.
So incredible. And luckily enough, after that, she agreed then to work on with me. So we did Componist and Sesto, we did Octavian, we did every kind of role debut I've had
Oh,
since
wonderful.
then. But very quickly we moved on to the orchestral repertoire. And as she very rightly said, like I, who came and still come from such a culture of storytelling, that we had to also use that in the German repertoire because there's so much incredible lieder repertoire. And I mean, I cannot explain to you how interesting it is to make a program with her.
Mm.
Her knowledge, first of all, of the repertoire, how she can remember every song. It's so interesting the way her brain works because she remembers every story of every song, not always maybe the title, but every story. And that way she's able to click what stories go together and how you make the program work with or without pausa. And, really, really valuable stuff for me going forward, and also things that I will be able to pass on to other people. She's so giving of her time. I can call at any time and say, okay, where are you? I need to come. Like I've a problem with this, or I have to jump in with that. And I was quite hesitant, I have to say, for a very long time about doing orchestral symphony work because I felt most of it would be kind of too dramatic or too taxing, which she absolutely laughed at. And the work I've done with her on Mahler has been, for me, earth-shattering, because obviously I'm at the point now too where I know a lot of conductors very well, and they also know me and my voice and my abilities, and I trust a lot more than I did when I started. But her knowledge of Mahler and color, and also the color from the orchestra, and it's not something you can read in a book. It's also not something I think you can discover straight away by yourself, because you'd have to be in the perfect circumstances with the perfect conductor and the perfect orchestra. So the things you can learn, or the things that she's willing to teach and help me understand, are, I mean, it's invaluable, the time with her. And also her herself, where her father was such a great singer, she also then has the traditions of the people before us and the whole generation and what they built. So again, it's part of this huge legacy, I feel. Um, I obviously spend a lot of time also looking at Rossini repertoire that's not done very often. So I will sometimes also bring her things she maybe doesn't know or didn't perform herself. Like recently we did the Desdemona of Rossini,
Hmm.
or La Donna del Lago. And it's so interesting because when somebody like that, who maybe the voice was definitely flexible, but maybe that didn't spend that much time with such kind of gymnastic stuff, what her ears can find disturbing, or what she can point out, are things you'd never get from a Rossini coach, because it's listening all the time for vocal quality. And I found that the work with her has really been, it's like been a progression from Ronnie. The interesting thing for me was that they had worked together,
Ah,
Ronnie and Brigitte. And so Brigitte knew exactly what I was coming from. It was Ronnie's idea that I go and study with her. So it was this beautiful kind of passing over, and I can go from one to the other to say, what we're all working on. It's this kind of big team. But there's so much to be said for her, also her recording legacy. I
yeah.
mean, the state of the recording industry has really changed. Um, and I worry that our generation, unless we find a way of fixing it, I don't know how it can ever recover. But the legacy of what she has recorded is so important. And for her 80th birthday, they re-released most of her recordings. Just the leader alone, that repertoire, I mean, between herself and Fischer Disco, what they recorded is
Yeah.
mind blowing. And every student should own it, in my opinion. Every student from both of them, especially some of the work they did together. It's so vital. And I think the more we can pass that on to the next generation, the longer the recital world will live, you
Well,
know?
what you address actually ties in with the question I have in my head that was my next question for you. So we'll connect them. You are still a very young woman, but you are, but you have learned a phenomenal amount, and you've had the privilege of working with these extraordinary teachers, and you've learned 48 roles in a short period of time and done them. Do you write things down? Do you write what you've learned down? Because there is a book here, even if it's not a bestseller, but it will be a manual of what you've learned for the future. The reason I've written 9 books is to document what I've learned so that when I'm not here, yes, there are videos of the type you and I are doing now that people watch in the future to when you are 90 years old and teaching in Dublin or Munich, and they will wonder what you were like at your age now. And I worry a lot about all knowledge, that it's just vanishing because books are being tossed out rather than libraries being designed for them. People
Sure.
no longer, if they don't find it on Google, they don't know it. They don't have tactile life experience with senior people who are knowledgeable. I try to do these kind of conversations at New York University and wherever I work and teach so that all of this is documented, because it's just super important. I began very young, so I was able to know Fischer Dieskau. My teacher was Tito Gobi. I studied with Herman Pry, and I worked with all of these great artists. I knew very well Joan Sutherland, Marilyn Horne, Kiri Takano, people like that. I worked with Shirley Verrett. I worked with
Amazing.
them all the time and learned from them. Pavarotti was a very dear friend of mine for 29 years. And if you saw the documentary about him, I was the advisor on that documentary.
Amazing.
And I worked a lot with Carreras. I worked a lot with Domingo. I can't say I knew John Vickers, but I had the experience of working in the presence of John Vickers, Carla Bergonzi, all these people. And I feel it's imperative, because I can write and I can speak, that this be documented. And in the absence of recordings, Tara, that in the past it was customary that every artist would get her series of recordings, how are you going to preserve and pass on what you've learned and
Well,
done?
I've been so lucky that from my first singing lesson, age 10. My teacher then, there was Geraldine McGee. She's a lady here in her late 90s, still in our local town. She insisted that every single singing lesson was recorded, every single lesson. So with the diligence of my family, not only do I have every single singing lesson from before I went to college, during my entire time in college. Since then, we've obviously moved from cassette tape to voice notes. So for the last 14 years, I have every voice note of it, not only every singing lesson, but every coaching. Now that started purely as something for me to be able to go back on. Because, you know, we're all, you know, when I was at college, I wasn't been taught independence. If anything, I was taught to be dependent on other people's ears, something that I still believe people should be dependent on other people's ears. But to make sure I'm practicing properly, I have to listen back. So I have all of these. So from the lessons and coachings, that's all sorted and fixed, and I have it. However, I am prone to funny accidents on stage, some silly, stupid things, but they started happening very early, and because people found them hysterically funny, I did have to start writing stories down because I was terrified I'd forget who else was there. Because you know the way sometimes something can happen and it's so ridiculous, you need proof. You need a witness. So I also have two now at this stage. We're on number two. Two notebooks full of anecdotes. Or sometimes when I meet people and they tell you a story, you know, one of the big things for me, for example, when I came to New York to make a debut, I desperately wanted to sing in St. Patrick's Cathedral, because for the Irish Catholic, that's like, I mean, it's like Rome, you know. And I had granduncles who had said mass there at certain times, and it was really also important for my parents. And the 6 months, so I made my debut in the September, but I knew I was going back to the Met over Christmas. And I spent 6 months writing to everybody, to the Irish ambassador and the consulate, and I wrote to Peter Gelp, and I wrote to anybody. Does anybody know how I can get to sing in the cathedral? And of course, the man in New York that knows everybody, Barry Tucker. It was Jamie Barton that called me, and she was like, look, you're annoying everybody at this stage. Call Barry and we'll see. He must know somebody. So anyway, I call Barry, and the next thing, push comes to shove, and I get offered the opportunity to sing at midnight mass on Christmas Eve. So the biggest night in the Catholic year. Not only that, but they're going to live stream it, which was massive. Yeah. Because of course my grandparents were here in Ireland. My parents had come, and all my cousins came in from New Jersey, and we got tickets for everybody. It was this incredible thing. But I was afraid of forgetting the details of that night. So every bit of it is written, because I'm not great always, especially at the time, of expressing what's happening. But I was terrified I'd forget the smallest detail, you know. So yeah, all those anecdotal things I have.
Placido Domingo, from the very beginning of his 60+ year career, wrote down details of every performance.
Amazing.
And he has a phenomenal memory. But the thing is, when someone goes, we don't have their memory. We have what they've put down, what they've documented. And that's why he knows so well what he did, where he did, who the colleagues were. And I have singer and musician friends, and they don't do that. And it's not vanity, it's history, it's culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Because even in your still young career, you've worked with some stupendous musicians and directors and so on. And that, you know, 25 years from now, when young women in Ireland and everywhere will be hearing you and wondering about your beginnings, you need to get that down. You really do. I have a friend, and I told him to keep the program from every single performance that he does.
Exactly.
And build a shelf and have them in date order, and just insert them on the shelf and leave them there, so you can then get them and tag it 2019, 2020, 2021.
Exactly.
And then when the time comes to go back, it will all be there.
Yeah.
I want to take you back to Ireland, because I love Ireland. You were talking at the beginning about growing up singing Irish songs.
Yeah.
Um, a few years ago, was in Dublin with my mother, and she was not feeling too well. And we had a doctor come to the hospital, which was opposite the National Concert Hall.
Yeah.
And he wrote the prescription in Gaelic. He did not want to write it in English. And I don't really know what he had. She had a low fever, but he wouldn't detail. And I was to take it to the local chemist, the pharmacy, and present it in Gaelic. He told me I know you know the geography. You exit the hotel, you turn right, it's on the corner,
Yeah.
is that pharmacy. And they read it. And I said, could you tell me what my mother has? No, we can only tell your mother. And I said, but she's in bed in the hotel down the street. And please tell me so I can tell her what she had. So they did, and what the solution was. And we had to stay on 2 more days in Dublin than planned until she got better.
Okay.
And when we got the taxi to go to the airport, um, the driver came and I said, my mother is mostly better, but she's going to sit in the back and be quiet. And now I can't do the accent all that well. And he said, ach, we're all dying. We're all dying. He said, I've got it too. Whatever it is, I got it too. And what this leads me to is that I am not of Irish background. But when I was a small child and my mother was a single parent working and she would go to work, I was put in the care when I was about 6 or 7 of an Irish family with 9 children. And they were very poor, and they lived in Brooklyn, and the few dollars my mother gave them made a difference. And we would sit around this cramped table, the 9 kids and Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, and we would have tea and lots of toast and lots of orange preserve, Irish tea, of course. And we would sing, and they would all talk almost at once. And it was so animated and so full of laughter and so loving. And I picked up the musical cadences of their speech. And that's what I want to get
Sure.
to. That the first time I got to Ireland, I was 19. And I traveled all over the country. I began in Dublin. I went to Galway. I went to many places, and it was so wonderful. And the people were so hospitable. Half the time, I didn't know what they were talking about, but they all wanted to communicate. And I went into a pub somewhere in the, what's it called, the Ring in the southwest part
On
of the
Kerry.
island, Ring of
Yeah.
Kerry. And I was seeking directions to go someplace, and the wife of the man who owned the pub said, you go down this way and you pass the church and you go by the farm and you say hello to Mrs. O'Reilly, and then you go this way, then you go that way. And I couldn't fathom those directions. And after she went in to wash dishes, her husband said, don't pay attention. She hasn't been there in 30 years. It was the desire to
Oh, I
communicate,
love it.
and that,
Yeah.
among the many things I love in Ireland, is this intensely communicative population.
Yes.
And yes, we can think of, the solitary Irish writers of Beckett and others who would sit alone and struggle with the fates, but the Irish live for their language. And
Absolutely.
whether Gaelic or English, but
Hmm.
do you speak Gaelic?
Well, we all, I mean, everyone learns it.
Yeah,
And I think, I mean, the curriculum hasn't really changed Irish wise since I was at school. But what I love now, like Ireland in the last 20 years has become so much more multicultural,
yeah.
especially this side of the island. And I love to see now like children that, they're speaking Polish and Irish and learning English, or Nigerian and Irish and learning English. And it's so wonderful to see that people are really putting an emphasis on the importance of the language. My brother, for example, he retrained recently as a guard, as a policeman, and they all also have to be able to speak Irish. And he was saying, God, he hasn't done an Irish exam since he was at high school. But it's a core part of the curriculum, and long may it last that way. You have to
Yeah,
do it also right the way through high school, and you can't get into university if you don't pass your Irish exam, regardless of what you want to study. And I'm a real believer of the importance in that. I mean, when I went to study or to work then in continental Europe and realized that, you know, I had Romanian colleagues that could speak like 6 and 7 languages, or the amount of people who in Europe still study Latin in order to have a better grasp of most of the languages. I mean, in Ireland, we nearly didn't push Irish hard enough. And I think depending on the generation, there were still people that were so scarred from the Troubles and so afraid. And what's beautiful to see is that the children that are at school now, their parents are of my generation and maybe only slightly older, and they didn't really know the Troubles or lived through them, and so there's a new pride and a new kind of bravery again to use the language that, you know, it's not going to be taken away from you, or you're not going to get in trouble for having it. And I think that's really brilliant. The other thing is too, I mean, we have such a wealth of culture, where, you know, and whether it's music or poetry and literature and art, I mean, it is incredible. And I love that, you know, it doesn't really matter what language, you know, if you know a song and you know half of it in Irish and half of it in English, that'll do. Just give it all you've got and tell the story as best you can, because even in times of famine, that was all we had in this country, was the culture and the stories. And whether you could sing the story or recite it or however it was, that was all that we had, and we still have that. And I think it's such a beautiful part of our kind of cultural heritage, the fact that we teach the kids also some of these like crazy old songs that probably make absolutely no sense to them, or that most children here in school will learn to play the tin whistle, for example, and they're not taught straight away to read from the stave or anything. It's all on their ear, because of course traditionally that's how it was. And I'm just so proud to see how much of that is still happening and how important it is still in the school system, because the longer we can keep the music in the schools, the longer we can ensure its kind of longevity, you know.
I struggle with the trying to read it and pronounce it, because if I take my English consonants and vowels and I see, for example, a name of a colleague of yours, Niamh,
Yes.
or H, as I've heard, and it's Neve, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How
Yeah.
do we get from Niamh to Neve,
Well,
who's a wonderful singer, by the way?
beautiful singer. And funny enough, I was given an interview last Monday in Munich, and they wanted to announce her because she had been in the final of a big competition in Germany. And the woman was like, Niamaha, Niamaha. I was like, no, Neve, Neve. I couldn't, no matter how I wrote it phonetically, I also couldn't help her. And then God bless her, one of the Australian girls that had an Irish name also was in the final of the competition, and her name was Siobhan,
Yes.
Siobhan. I mean, the poor presenter was tripping over her own tongue. So eventually I read the list.
Was this Siobhan Stagg? Was this
No,
Siobhan Stagg or another Siobhan?
no, she's like, what the heck? Was she Donnelly? Siobhan. She had done very well in this competition called Debut in Germany, but the reason she had found out about the competition was because Siobhan Stagg had
I
advertised
see.
it.
I don't know how much you've explored Irish New York, but New York is intensely Irish, intensely Jewish, intensely Latino, intensely African American. It's wonderful because of all the mixing. But as I said, I grew up partially with an Irish family. But we have, and I'm a member of something called the Irish Repertory Theater on 22nd Street. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but all the great Irish actors come to New York, or many of them are now resident in New York, and perform Irish repertory at the Irish Theater. And they recently had a fundraising campaign, expanded their facilities, and they painted the walls a dark green, and which is a very soothing environment to be inside a theater. But like Ireland itself, which is a small country but punches culturally way above its weight, so does the Irish Repertory Theater in New York. And we have all kinds of, obviously, bars and restaurants and clubs and speaking societies, and the St. Patrick's Day parade is a big deal
Oh
on
yeah.
March 17th. But you were saying that Ireland has, especially Dublin, has become very multicultural. I grew up in a place that was always multicultural from the very beginning. And it's wonderful to see how these peoples influence one another. My favorite film actor of the past is James Cagney, who was an Irish
Sure.
New Yorker. I live not too far from the church where he had his funeral, and I went to his funeral, as one could do here. And it's fascinating because we all have a piece of it. But I remember so well that on my first visit to Dublin in 1976, I met a woman, I liked her, and she said to me, you know, the Irish are a lot more subtle than you think. And it always stuck in my head because our New York Irish are very open, very boisterous, and so on. And I take her guidance from 44 years ago, and it sticks in my head, and I try to follow what she said. Siobhan was her name, that the Irish are much more subtle than we think. What does that mean to you as a statement?
I mean, it's interesting. I can say, for example, that I have heard for years and years about St. Patrick's Day, or week as it turns into, in the US in general. But this past February, March was my first February, March in the country. And I was taken aback at the amount of stuff, just stuff, this Irish stuff that appeared everywhere. I mean, I was beyond touched that the porters at the opera decorated the whole place with leprechauns and shamrocks. It was amazing. But I thought, honestly, I thought that was just for me. Then I walked down the street and I'd seen you could buy like a shamrock tree, or you could buy all sorts of paraphernalia for your St. Patrick's decorations. That, in that sense, being Irish is a much more subtle thing, because being Irish, doesn't matter if you're Irish or not, being Irish is being as good to anybody you meet as you possibly can be, to be as welcoming as you possibly can be to anybody. And there's no point in having loads of something if the person beside you has nothing, regardless of what that something is, money or food or whatever. And I find what makes me most proud when I'm here is how, when I invite somebody from another country and they come in and they see just how welcomed they are, regardless of race or creed or orientation or anything. It just doesn't matter. And I think for some obscure reason, the reputation of the country worldwide was of kind of loud and big drinkers, and
Yeah.
and where, yes, no question, you can have an amazing time when you're here or when you're with a group of Irish people, but by God, you will be looked after. Yeah. Whoever you are, wherever you're from. And I think that's sometimes, I don't want to say misunderstood, because I think it's noted if you've experienced it, but you know, like I have met, especially on my while working, and sometimes you're invited to receptions and things afterwards, and I have met people from 2 or 3 generations older than I am who would still, I don't want to say be racist, but they would still look down quite a lot on the Irish, and that, you know.
It's very real. I hate to say that, but certainly in England, I've experienced that a lot when I profess my love for Ireland and I'm dismissed.
Yeah.
Often. But I hate to say that, but often.
Yeah.
And it's an old stereotype there. But
Absolutely.
The English often say to me things like, you know a lot for an American. I don't know how to answer that.
But I think that's the thing, that these stereotypes that I don't really know how they went so worldwide. But each country, you know, the same as a lot of people would think, oh, well, the English are maybe snobby, or I'm not sure even. No. But the stereotypes that went around the world, it's strange how they traveled. And yet now, with the next generation, certainly we have the ability to change that. But I definitely think that when people come here, they're often kind of taken aback at how, like, they expect something else. Especially American visitors when they come. And I do think they leave happy, but it may not be the experience that they expected. Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, I find that really interesting. And I love when people come, especially on their first trip, because I think they expect it to be quite wild. And then they see that actually it can be a very soothing
Yeah.
experience, you know.
Yeah.
And I certainly, you know, a few years ago, Angela Brower, who I mentioned earlier, Angela's from Arizona and grew up in the desert. And a few summers ago, Angela comes here every Christmas, but a few summers ago she came, and herself and my sister and I, we did a road trip around Ireland so she could see the cliffs of Moher and the Atlantic Ocean and all the rest. And it was then that I realized how calming such a trip can actually be, and to go, you know, to different music sessions in the pub. So at the time, none of us were drinking, but we would go on these pub crawls because you go from session to session. And she was absolutely, her mind boggled when she seen that random men had tin whistles in their jacket pockets, you know, and anybody would play. And I mean, by the last pub we were in, she was also singing,
Yeah.
you know, and I think the experience can be really different from what maybe is expected or what people have maybe seen in a movie, or, you know, but I think that can be said for each country and the stereotypes that go in front of each country.
I think what's particular about Ireland and the Irish is that the country, I believe, has about 4 or 5 million people, but the
Mm-hmm.
Irish diaspora, there are tens of millions of people of Irish origin in the United States, certainly Boston especially, but also New York,
Mm-hmm.
Chicago, and other cities, Canada, uh, Australia, a bit all over the world. And
Mm-hmm.
so people who are of an ethnic origin, it could be Russian, Jewish, or Italian, tend to maintain the older traditions that are no longer current in the nation. So that when I write about Italian food, I'll go to places like Argentina and Toronto to visit communities of older Italian peoples who cook in a way and use language in a way that you no longer hear in Italy. So
Sure.
it's like doing archaeology of culture. And similarly, it's what happens with the Irish, where, I mean, the Irish, we have Ronald Reagan was Irish, Joseph Biden is Irish. We like to say that Barry Obama is Irish, but he actually does have a little bit of Irish in him on his mother's
Oh, he
side.
does.
Yeah, he
Yes,
does.
yes. Yeah, yeah.
And I went to a pub in Dublin that he likes, Matt the Drover, am I remembering it
Oh,
correctly?
yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
which has some of the best fish cookery that I've had in the world
Amazing.
right
Amazing.
there. So, you know, you mentioned this about Ireland being soothing. That's a very good word. About 3 years ago, I don't talk politics much on this program, but about a year into the Trump administration, I had had quite enough, having no idea what was to come. And I had a few days, it was in November, which is not the best time to visit Ireland, but I just got an air ticket to Dublin and stayed in a hotel. I was to appear on the national radio network, the RTE, or the RTE as is still today. And I went to the talk at the Royal Irish Academy. And but I stayed in a bed and breakfast, not in central Dublin, but near the RTE, that
Okay.
district, I forget what it's called, and walked up the street every day. It
Beautiful.
was misty. There was very little light. I was on the top floor and I had to climb up. It was terrific. And gulls would fly around and I hear the
Sure.
cry of gulls from the Dublin Bay. And I'd eat prawns and I'd eat porridge in the morning and drink tea. And because it was November and there were no tourists around, it was very
Mhm.
quiet. It was so soothing, the word you used, that when I came back to New York after 4 nights in Dublin, I felt much better. It was like the Irish cure.
Amazing.
So I would be there more if I could. I plan to be once we're all
Soon.
allowed to
Soon.
travel.
Yeah.
Tara, we could talk endlessly. I'm very grateful. I commend to listeners the wonderful list, including Wagner, Mozart, Mahler, Veronica Dunn, Tchaikovsky, Leonard Bernstein, Rossini, and Richard Strauss, of your musical selections. Um, I want people, whether they travel to Munich or to Ireland, or when you can be out and about singing in the world and you come back here to New York to sing La Cenerentola, Um, I want people to know your name. You're very modest, but you are an exemplary artist who is very special. And people who know your work, love your work. I spotted you younger, much
Thank
younger
you.
than you are, and have followed your work for a long time. We have a mutual friend who mentioned you to me for the first time. And um, keep up the good work. You are very young and you have a lot to learn, but you have so much more to teach at this point. And I really hope that you document what you've learned, because you have a special gift for absorbing that and expressing
Sure.
that. And that will be crucial for the future of opera. That may sound like a lot to put on your shoulders, but I think you understand what I mean. Just
I do.
learning
Yeah.
the Veronica Dunn method and all that Brigitte Fassbinder, plus many other colleagues you've worked with
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
teachers, it's so essential for the future, not just of performers such as yourself, but people who share and teach this to the world, such as myself. And anything you want to say to us in Gaelic before we go?
I could have practiced. Oh my goodness, put me on the spot. My grandmother would be mortified. Um, so here, when somebody's leaving your house or leaving your party or something, you'd say "Slán agus banach liv galéir." So you know, good luck and mind yourselves. I think that's the one thing in the Irish culture that goes a little bit above and beyond, is that you always wish somebody a healthy and safe passage, you know, leaving you, and you never really ever say goodbye. It's always until the next time, until we meet again. And I think that's something
Like
that
German, Auf Wiedersehen.
exactly,
Yeah,
I really I find solace in that, also in the career we have, that you never
yeah,
ever really say goodbye to anybody. You say see you next time.
yeah. So
Yeah.
Tara, I'll see you next time. Thank
Looking
you.
forward.
It was great.
Super.